I didn't mean to hit him, but the moment his hand didn't pull away, something inside me decided I wasn't that girl anymore. The bass from the speakers thumped so hard it felt like a second heartbeat, vibrating through my ribs as I balanced a tray of drinks that cost more than my weekly rent, neon lights slicing across the club in flashes of violet and gold, turning everyone into strangers made of shadows and shine, and I kept my eyes down like I always did, because girls like me didn't belong in places like this. Not really. We just passed through, invisible until someone decided we weren't, and tonight that someone was Lucas Hayes, the kind of rich that didn't ask, the kind that assumed, his voice smooth with too much confidence as he leaned closer, too close, like the air around me belonged to him too, and I told myself to ignore it, just smile, just step away, just survive another shift, because rent was due in 4 days and tips mattered more than pride. But then his fingers pressed again, casual like it meant nothing, like I meant nothing, and suddenly the music blurred, the lights dimmed, and all I could hear was my own breath catching, sharp and uneven, because I'd felt that before, that quiet taking, that slow erasing, and I had promised myself I wouldn't let it happen again, not here, not ever, so my hand moved before I could stop it, fast and final. The sound cutting clean through the noise, a single sharp crack that didn't belong in a place built on pretending, and everything froze, conversations hanging midair, glasses paused halfway to lips, even the lights felt like they hesitated, and Lucas stared at me like I'd broken something he owned, not his cheek, but his expectation, his control, his easy certainty that girls like me didn't fight back, and for half a second I felt it too. The weight of what I'd just done pressing down on my chest, because this wasn't a movie and there were consequences for stepping out of line, especially in a room full of people who could erase you without raising their voices, and then he smiled. But it wasn't the kind of smile that meant anything good, low and quiet as he leaned in just enough for me to hear, telling me I had no idea who I'd just embarrassed, and maybe I didn't. Maybe I should have been afraid. Maybe I should have apologized. But something in me stayed still, held, like I'd already crossed a line I couldn't uncross, and that's when it changed. Not loudly. Not dramatically, just a shift in the air, subtle but undeniable, like the moment before a storm when everything goes too quiet, people stepping back without knowing why, conversations fading into nothing, and I didn't turn at first, didn't need to, because whatever walked into that room didn't ask for attention, it took it, and when I finally looked up, I understood why everyone else had already moved, because he wasn't just another man in an expensive suit. He was the kind of presence that rewrote the rules without saying a word, his gaze landing on me first, steady, unreadable, like he was seeing something no one else had noticed, and then, slowly, he shifted his attention to Lucas, and in that single glance, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Lucas opened his mouth like he was about to laugh it off again, but the sound never came out because the man standing across from him did not move, did not raise his voice, did not even change his expression, and somehow that was worse. The music kept playing somewhere above us, but it felt distant, like it belonged to another room, another world, and I realized I was holding my breath waiting for something I could not name. The man stepped forward, one pace slow, controlled. Every movement deliberate, like he had all the time in the world, and everyone else knew it too, because no one interrupted, no one questioned, no one even pretended this was normal. Lucas tried again, forcing a smile that did not reach his eyes, saying something about a misunderstanding, about how this was none of his business, but the words sounded smaller, weaker, like they lost their shape the moment they left his mouth. The man did not respond right away, he just looked at him, not angry, not loud, just certain, and that certainty spread through the room faster than any shout could have. I felt it in my chest, in the way my heartbeat slowed instead of racing, like my body understood something my mind was still catching up to. Then finally, he spoke one word, clear, calm, impossible to ignore: apologize. Lucas blinked, like he had not heard correctly, like his world did not include moments where someone could tell him what to do and mean it. He let out a short laugh, glancing around, as if someone would step in, support him, remind everyone who he was, but no one moved, not the security, not his friends, not even the people who had been laughing with him minutes ago. The silence stretched thin and heavy, and I could see It then the shift in his confidence, the crack forming where arrogance used to be. He tried to straighten his posture, tried to recover, saying he did nothing wrong, saying I overreacted, but even as he spoke his voice lacked the same weight it had before because the man in front of him had already decided what was true and everyone else was just catching up. The man's gaze flicked to me for a brief second, and in that moment I felt seen in a way that was not uncomfortable, not invasive, just steady like. He was measuring something beyond what anyone else noticed. Then his attention returned to Lucas, and he did not repeat himself. He did not need to. Lucas hesitated, and that hesitation said more than any apology could. His shoulders dropped just slightly, his voice lowering as he muttered something that almost sounded like regret, but not quite enough, not real enough. Still, the man accepted it with a small nod, like the outcome had already been written from the start. Two men appeared beside Lucas so quietly I did not even see where they came from, and they guided him away, not roughly, not dramatically, just final, like closing a door that would not be opened again. The crowd slowly exhaled, conversations restarting in cautious whispers, the illusion returning piece by piece. But it felt different now, thinner, like everyone had just been reminded that there were rules here they did not make. My legs felt unsteady as the adrenaline faded, leaving behind something else, something sharper, awareness maybe. Fear, maybe something more complicated. I could not look away from him as he turned fully toward me, the distance between us suddenly too small and too large at the same time. He studied me for a second longer. Then comfortable, but not enough to feel threatening, and when he spoke his voice was low, steady, meant only for me. You should not have had to do that. I swallowed, unsure what to say, because he was right, and also completely wrong, because I knew if I had not done it no one else would have. He tilted his head slightly like he could hear the argument forming in my silence. Then he said something that made my chest tighten in a way I did not expect. This place forgets who deserves respect, and for the first time since the slap, I felt something shift inside me, not fear, not relief, something closer to recognition, like I had just stepped into a version of the world where the rules were different, and I had no idea what that meant for me next. I should have walked away right then, taken the chance he had given me, and disappeared back into the blur of lights and music like none of it ever happened, but my feet stayed rooted to the floor like something invisible had shifted beneath me, and I was no longer standing in the same place as before. He did not move closer immediately. He gave me space, just enough to breathe, just enough to decide whether I would step back or stay, and that choice felt heavier than anything that had happened tonight, because for the first time, someone with real power was not forcing the moment, he was waiting for it. I let out a slow breath. I did not realize I was holding my fingers, tightening slightly around the empty tray like it could anchor me to something familiar. Something safe. I can handle myself, I said finally, my voice quieter than I expected, but steady enough to not break. He did not react the way most men did. There was no smirk, no challenge, no dismissal, just a small shift in his gaze, like he was adjusting how he saw me, recalculating something. I know, he replied simply, and those two words landed differently than anything else that had been said tonight, because they did not question me, they did not test me, they acknowledged me, and somehow that was more unsettling than everything that came before. The music swelled again around us, louder now, like the club was trying to recover from the silence, but it felt artificial, like everyone was pretending they had not just witnessed something real. I became aware of the stares again, the whispers, the way people looked at me, not as invisible anymore, but as someone who had crossed a line they would never dare approach, and I hated it. I hated being seen like that, exposed, defined by a single moment. But when I glanced back at him, I realized he was not looking at me that way at all. He was studying me like a decision had already been made, and I was just catching up to it. What is your name? He asked, not demanding, not casual, just direct. Emily. I answered before I could think about whether I should, and something about saying my name in that moment felt like giving away more than I intended. He nodded once, like that confirmed something, then his gaze moved briefly to the floor where the faint mark of the spilled drink still caught the light, then back to me. Emily, he repeated quieter, and I felt it again, that strange shift, like the world narrowing down to a single point where everything else blurred at the edges. I should have said something else, should have stepped back into the role I knew how to play, polite, distant, forgettable, but the words did not come, because a part of me did not want to disappear this time. A part of me wanted to understand why the room still felt different, why he still felt like the only solid thing in it. You should leave early tonight, he said after a moment, his tone unchanged, but something beneath it sharper, more certain. This place will not feel the same after this. I frowned slightly, not because I disagreed, but because I did not understand what he meant. I need the shift I replied automatically, the reality of rent bills, responsibilities rushing back in like cold air. He studied me again longer this time, and I felt like he could see every reason behind that answer, every late night, every compromise, every quiet decision to endure instead of fight, and for a second I wondered what he saw when he looked at me. Not the uniform, not the situation, but me. That will not be a problem anymore, he said, and the way he said it made my stomach tighten, not in fear, not exactly, but in awareness, because those words did not sound like a suggestion, they sounded like a change already in motion, and before I could ask what he meant, before I could decide whether to accept or reject whatever that implied, he stepped back. Just one pace, creating distance again, but not breaking the connection. Finish what you need to finish, he added calmly, then come find me, and with that he turned, not waiting for my answer, not checking if I would follow, just walking away like he already knew I would. And that was the moment I realized the night had not ended with a slap, it had just begun with a choice I had not made yet. I tried to focus on the next order, but my hands were not steady anymore. The tray felt heavier than before, like it carried more than just glasses, like it carried the weight of a decision I had not made yet. The music was louder now, people laughing again, pretending nothing had happened, but every time I walked past a table I felt it, the shift in their eyes, the curiosity, the caution, the way conversations dipped when I got too close and rose again when I moved away, like I had become something they could not quite place, and I hated how aware I was of it, how I kept replaying his voice in my head, calm, certain, like he had already moved on while I was still standing in the middle of it. My manager caught my arm near the bar, his grip tight, but not rough, his expression a mix of forced calm and quiet panic. What was that? He asked under his breath, glancing around like the walls might be listening. Do you have any idea who that was? I swallowed, trying to steady my voice. He crossed a line, I said simply, because that was the only truth that mattered to me, but he shook his head quickly like that answer was not enough. That is not how this works here, Emily, he said lower, now more urgent. People like him do not get slapped, people like him get protected. I almost laughed at that, because if that was true, then what had just happened did not fit into his version of the world at all. I glanced toward the private section where the man had disappeared earlier, the crowd parting subtly around that space, without even realizing it. Not all of them, I said quietly, more to myself than to him. My manager followed my gaze, and his expression changed instantly, recognition flashing across his face, followed by something close to fear. You need to stay away from that side tonight, he said quickly, stepping back like he had already said too much. Finish your shift, keep your head down, and do not make this worse. He walked away before I could respond, leaving me standing there with more questions than answers, and a feeling that staying invisible was no longer an option. I moved through the rest of the floor on instinct, muscle memory carrying me through orders and smiles and polite exchanges, but my mind was somewhere else, tracking the edges of the room, the movement of people, the quiet gravity pulling everything toward one direction. Every time I caught a glimpse of him, it was brief, a shift of black fabric, a turn of his head, a conversation that ended the moment he looked away, like he controlled more than just the space around him. He controlled the rhythm of the entire night, and I could not ignore the fact that he had told me to come find him, not asked, not suggested. Told, and the certainty in that still lingered in my chest like a question waiting for an answer. When my shift finally slowed, the clock on the wall reading just past 1:30 in the morning, I stood behind the bar for a second longer than necessary, staring at nothing, listening to the steady hum of music and voices blending together into something almost distant. I could walk out now, take my tips, go home, pretend this was just another night that got out of hand, but I knew I would think about it later, replay it again and again, wondering what would have happened if I had stayed, if I had followed through on something I did not fully understand. My fingers tightened slightly against the counter, then loosened as I made a decision that did not feel impulsive or reckless, just inevitable. I set the tray down, took a slow breath, and stepped away from the bar, moving toward the private section where the air felt different, quieter, more controlled, like the rest of the club did not quite reach it. The closer I got, the more I felt it again, that shift in atmosphere, the subtle awareness from the people standing near the entrance, the way they looked at me, not stopping me, but not ignoring me either, like they were waiting to see if I belonged there or not. I hesitated for half a second, just long enough to feel the weight of crossing another line, then I kept walking, and the moment I stepped into that space, I saw him standing near the back, one hand resting casually against the edge of a table, his posture relaxed, but nothing about him unfocused. His gaze lifted the instant I entered, like he had been expecting this exact moment, and something in my chest tightened, not from fear, not from doubt, but from the realization that whatever came next was no longer something I could step away from easily. He did not smile when I walked in, and somehow that made it easier to breathe, because it meant this was not a performance, not a game, not something designed to impress anyone else's attention. Settled on me the same way it had before, steady, focused, like the rest of the room had already faded out, and maybe it had. I slowed my steps without meaning to, aware of every inch of distance between us, the sound of my shoes against the floor suddenly too loud in the quiet of that space. I stopped a few feet away, not close enough to feel trapped, not far enough to pretend I had not come here on purpose. For a second neither of us spoke, and the silence did not feel awkward, it felt measured, like something was being decided in it. "You came," he said finally, his voice low, calm, like he had expected nothing less. I crossed my arms lightly, not defensive, just grounding. "You told me to," I replied, and the words sounded more honest than I intended, because that was exactly why I was here. Not curiosity, not fear, just the simple fact that when he spoke it felt like something worth listening to. His gaze flickered slightly at that, like he noticed the difference in tone and choice, and then he nodded once, acknowledging it. "Most people would have left," he said, and I shrugged faintly. "Most people did not slap someone tonight," I answered, and for the first time something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but close enough to feel it. He stepped slightly to the side, gesturing toward the chair across from him, not forcing, not insisting, just offering space. I hesitated for half a second, then sat down, placing my hands on the edge of the table, keeping my posture straight, like I was still working, still in control, even if part of me knew that was not entirely true. He remained standing for a moment longer, studying me like he was reading something beneath the surface. Then he took the seat opposite me, his movements smooth, controlled, never rushed. "You do not belong in a place like this," he said, not as an insult, not as a judgment, just a statement, and I felt a small spark of irritation rise, because I had heard that before in different words from different people who thought they knew better. "I work here," I replied evenly. "That means I do belong here." His eyes held mine for a second longer than necessary, like he was testing that answer, weighing it. Then he shook his head slightly. "You survive here," he corrected quietly. "That is not the same thing." The words landed heavier than I expected, because they were not wrong, and I hated that he could see it so clearly without knowing anything about me. I looked away for a brief moment, focusing on the edge of the table, the faint reflection of light across its surface. Anything to avoid the way his gaze seemed to strip things down to their truth. "And what about you?" I asked after a second, my voice softer but steady. "Do you belong here?" He did not answer immediately, and that pause felt deliberate, like he was choosing how much to reveal. "I built parts of places like this," he said finally, "so that men like him feel important." His tone did not change, but there was something under it, something colder, more distant. "And so that I know exactly who they are when it matters." I looked back at him, then really looked at him, not just the tailored suit or the calm presence, but the way he held himself, like everything around him was already accounted for, like nothing happened without his awareness. "And me?" I asked before I could stop myself. "What am I to you?" The question hung between us, heavier than anything else I had said tonight, and for the first time his gaze shifted slightly, not away, but deeper, like he was considering something beyond the moment, beyond the room, beyond me as I stood here now. "You are someone who does not bend when she is supposed to," he said quietly, and there was no judgment in it, no amusement, just certainty. "That makes you different." My chest tightened at that, because it was not praise, not exactly, but it felt like recognition, and that was more dangerous than anything else. He leaned back slightly, his posture relaxing, but his attention never leaving me. "And different things," he added after a brief pause. "Do not stay in places that try to make them smaller." I felt something shift inside me again, that same pull from earlier, stronger, now clearer, like a door had opened somewhere I had not known existed, and I was standing right at the edge of it, not pushed, not forced, just aware that stepping through would change something in a way I could not undo. His words did not feel like a suggestion, they felt like a shift, like something inside me had been quietly acknowledged, and now could not go back to being ignored. I leaned back slightly, creating just enough space to think, but the air between us still felt charged, like the conversation had already crossed into something neither of us could pretend was casual anymore. "You talk like it is that simple," I said, my voice quieter now, not defensive, just honest, "like people can just walk away from what they have built or what they need." He watched me carefully, not interrupting, not correcting, just letting the words exist between us before responding. "It is not simple," he said calmly. "It is a choice." The way he said it made it sound heavier than it should have, like choice was not freedom, but responsibility, and I felt that settle in my chest, because he was not offering an escape, he was pointing at Something I had been avoiding for a long time. I exhaled, slowly glancing down at my hands resting on the table, the faint imprint of pressure still visible where I had gripped the tray earlier tonight. A reminder of how fast everything could change, and if I choose wrong, I asked without looking up. He did not answer immediately, and when I finally lifted my gaze back to his, I saw something different there, not softer, not weaker, just more deliberate. "Then you learn faster than everyone else," he said, and something about that felt more real than any promise. Could have been. There was no reassurance in his voice, no guarantee, just truth, and for some reason that made me trust it more than anything else that had happened tonight. The music from the main floor pulsed faintly through the walls, a distant echo of the world I had been part of just an hour ago, and it felt strange how far away it seemed now, like I had stepped into a different version of the same night where the rules were not written the same way. Why me? I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it, because that was the part one could not understand. There were dozens of people out there, hundreds, maybe, all playing their roles, all fitting into the space in ways that made sense. So why had he noticed me? Why had he stepped in? Why was I sitting here now instead of finishing my shift and going home like nothing had happened? His gaze did not waver when he answered. "Because you did not ask for permission," he said simply. "You decided what was acceptable and acted on it." I held his eyes for a second, longer than I meant to, because that answer felt too precise, too direct, like he had seen through more than just one moment. "That gets people into trouble," I said quietly, and he nodded once. "It also keeps them from being controlled," he replied, and that word lingered, controlled, because I knew exactly what that felt like, even if I had never said it out loud, even if I had convinced myself I was just being practical, just surviving, just doing what needed to be done. The silence returned, but it was different now, not uncertain, not searching, just full, like something had already been set in motion, without either of us needing to say it outright. He leaned forward, slightly resting his hand against the table, his posture still relaxed, but his focus sharper. "You have two options tonight, Emily," he said evenly. "You walk out that door, go back to what you know, and this becomes a story you tell yourself later." He paused just long enough for that to settle before continuing. "Or you step into something you do not fully understand yet, but will not be able to ignore once you see it." My pulse quickened at that, not from fear, but from the weight of what he was saying, because this was not about the club anymore, not about the job, or the people, or even him. It was about something bigger. Something that had been building long before tonight, and had finally found a moment to surface. I swallowed slowly, feeling the decision pressing closer, like a tide that could not be held back forever. "And what happens if I choose the second option?" I asked, my voice steady, even though everything inside me felt like it was shifting. His expression did not change, but his eyes held mine with a certainty that left no room for misunderstanding. "Then you stop being invisible," he said quietly, "and the world will not treat you the same again." And for the first time since this night began, I realized that might be exactly what I wanted, even if I did not fully understand the cost yet. The word invisible stayed with me longer than anything else he had said, not because it sounded dramatic, but because it felt accurate in a way I had never admitted out loud. I had spent years moving through rooms like this unnoticed, unless someone decided to notice me on their terms, and now for the first time I was being asked if I wanted something different, not handed it, not forced into it, just asked, and somehow that made it harder. I looked past him for a second toward the edge of the private section where the music bled back in, where people were still laughing, still drinking, still pretending like nothing had shifted, and I realized I could walk back into that version of the night easily. I knew exactly how to disappear there, how to finish my shift, collect my tips, go home, and wake up tomorrow like this was just another story that almost changed something, but did not. My fingers pressed lightly against the table, grounding myself as I brought my focus back to him. "You make it sound like I have been waiting for this," I said quietly, and he tilted his head slightly, not disagreeing, not agreeing, just observing. "Have you not?" he asked, and the question landed heavier than I expected, because I did not have an immediate answer, not a real one, not one that did not expose something I had kept buried under routine and responsibility. I exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of that truth settle in my chest. "I have been trying to stay stable," I said instead, because that was easier, safer, something I could defend, pay rent, keep my job, avoid problems. He listened without interrupting, his expression unchanged, but his attention sharp, like he was cataloging every word. "That is not stability," he said after a moment. "That is control without power." I blinked at that, the phrasing catching me off guard, because it reframed everything in a way I had never considered before. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words did not come, because part of me knew he was right, even if I Did not want him to be. The silence stretched again, but it did not feel uncomfortable. It felt like something was shifting into place piece by piece, whether I was ready for it or not. He leaned back slightly, giving me space, but not distance. You are not here by accident, Emily, he continued calmly. Not tonight, not in this moment. I frowned faintly because that sounded too intentional, too precise for something that had started with a mistake, a reaction, a split-second decision. I made a choice, I said, correcting him. That does not mean it was meant to happen. His gaze held mine, steady, unwavering. Every choice leads somewhere, he replied. Most people just do not pay attention to where. I felt that again, that pull, that quiet pressure building beneath the surface, like something inside me was aligning with what he was saying, even if I had not fully accepted it yet. I glanced down briefly, then back up, meeting his eyes with more certainty than before. And where does this lead? I asked. In this time my voice did not waver. He did not answer right away, and for a second I wondered if he would deflect, if he would give me something vague, something safe, but he did not. That depends on whether you are ready to stop asking permission from a world that does not notice you unless you break its rules, he said, and the words hit harder than anything else tonight because they stripped away the last layer of comfort I had been holding onto, the idea that I could exist quietly without consequence, that I could avoid risk and still move forward. I leaned back slightly, letting out a slow breath, feeling the shift settle fully, this time not partial, not uncertain, just there. And you, I said after a moment, my gaze steady on his. What do you get out of this? It was the question I should have asked earlier, the one that mattered, the one that defined whether this was opportunity or something else entirely. His expression did not change, but there was something in his eyes now, something sharper, more deliberate. I do not invest in things that remain small, he said simply, and I do not ignore potential when I see it. My chest tightened at that, not from fear, not from doubt, but from the realization that whatever he was offering was not temporary, it was not casual, it was not something I could step into halfway. He was not asking me to follow him, he was asking me to step into a different version of myself, and that was a choice that would not let me go back unchanged. I held his gaze for a second longer, feeling the last hesitation fade, not because I had all the answers, but because I finally understood the question. Then I guess I am done being invisible, I said quietly, and for the first time since I had walked into that space, something shifted in his expression, not a smile, not approval, just recognition, like I had reached the point he already knew I would, and the moment I said it out loud, I knew there was no version of tonight where I walked away the same. He did not react immediately when I said it, and that somehow made the moment feel more real, like this was not something he needed to celebrate or question, it was simply something he had been waiting for. The music from outside drifted in again, faint but constant, a reminder that the rest of the world was still moving, still unaware that something had just shifted in mine. He studied me for a second longer, then gave a small nod, not approval, not praise, just acknowledgement, like I had stepped into a role that had always been there. Good, he said quietly, and that single word carried more weight than anything else, because it did not sound like encouragement, it sounded like confirmation. I exhaled slowly, feeling something settle inside me, not fear, not doubt, something steadier, like a line had been drawn and I had finally decided which side of it I was on. So what now? I asked, because that was the part one could not see yet, the next step, the direction, the consequence. He leaned back slightly, his posture relaxed, but his attention sharp as ever. Now you learn how to move differently, he replied. You pay attention to what people say, and more importantly, what they avoid saying. You stop reacting and start choosing. I listened carefully, the words not rushed, not dramatic, just precise, like instructions that mattered. And this place, I glanced briefly toward the main floor, where the lights flashed and people continued their night as if nothing had changed. This was just the beginning, he said simply, and I believed him, not because of how he said it, but because of how everything tonight had unfolded. Nothing had felt random, not really. It had all led here, whether I understood it at the time or not. He reached into his jacket pocket and placed a small card on the table, sliding it toward me without breaking eye contact. I looked down at it for a second. Plain black, no logo, no unnecessary detail, just a name and a number printed in clean, sharp letters. If you walk away tonight, you keep that as a reminder of what you almost stepped into, he said calmly. If you do not walk away, you use it. I picked it up slowly, feeling the smooth edge between my fingers, the weight of something so simple carrying more meaning than it should have. And if I call, I asked quietly, my eyes lifting back to his. He held my gaze steady, his expression unreadable but certain. Then you do not go back to being who you were before this, he answered, and there was no hesitation in his voice, no room for interpretation. The choice was clear, and so was the cost. I nodded once Not because I fully understood everything he was offering, but because I understood enough. He stood then, his movement unhurried, but final, like the conversation had reached its natural end. "Finish your night," he said, and there was something softer in his tone now, not weaker, just more measured. "Do not let anyone make you question what you did tonight." I felt that settle deeper than anything else, because for the first time since it happened, I was not replaying the moment with doubt. I was seeing it clearly for what it was, a decision, not a mistake. He turned slightly like he was about to leave, then paused just long enough to look back at me one more time. "The world only respects what refuses to shrink," he said quietly, and then he walked away, blending back into the space, like he had never disrupted it at all. I sat there for a second longer, the card still in my hand, the noise of the club slowly returning to full volume around me, but it did not feel the same anymore. Nothing did. I stood up, eventually moving back toward the main floor, but my steps felt different, steadier, more deliberate, like I was no longer just reacting to the night, but moving through it with purpose. Every glance, every whisper, every shift in energy registered differently now, like I had been given a new way to see something I had always been part of. And as I slipped the card into my pocket, I realized the real change had not been him stepping in earlier. It had been what came after the moment I decided I was not going back to being invisible, even if I had no idea yet what that would truly cost. I finished the rest of my shift on autopilot, but nothing about it felt automatic anymore. Every step, every interaction, every glance carried a different weight, like I was moving through the same space with a completely different awareness. People still talked to me, still ordered drinks, still smiled in that rehearsed way, but I could see more now, the hesitation behind confidence, the way certain people watched others before speaking, the way power moved quietly without needing attention, and I realized he had been right. This place had never been what I thought it was. I had just been too focused on surviving it to notice the patterns underneath. When the clock finally hit closing time, the lights softened, the music faded, and the illusion of the night began to dissolve into something quieter, more real. I changed out of my uniform in the back room, my hands slower than usual as I folded it neatly, placing it into my bag like I was closing a chapter one had not planned to end tonight. The other staff moved around me, talking about tips, about schedules, about everything that used to matter to me, and I listened without really hearing because my mind kept circling back to the card in my pocket, the weight of it small but impossible to ignore. My manager caught my eye before I left, his expression uncertain, like he did not know what to say to me anymore. "You okay?" he asked carefully, and I nodded once, because I was not sure how to explain something I barely understood myself. "I am fine," I said, and for the first time that answer felt true in a different way, not safe, not controlled, just honest. I stepped outside into the cool night air, the city stretching out in front of me, alive in a way that felt sharper, now clearer, like I was seeing it without the filter I had always used to make it manageable. My car was parked half a block away, the same place it had been every shift, the same walk I had taken 100 times before, but tonight it felt different. Every step measured, every thought louder than the noise of the street. I reached into my pocket, pulling out the card again, holding it between my fingers under the streetlight, the black surface catching just enough glow to make the name stand out. Adrian Volkov. I had heard that name before, not directly, not clearly, just in passing, in conversations that lowered their voices when they said it, in warnings that never fully explained themselves. And now I was standing here holding a direct line to him, like it was something I could choose to use or ignore. I leaned against my car for a moment, closing my eyes briefly, letting everything settle. The slap, the silence, the way the room had shifted, the way he had looked at me like I was something more than a background figure in someone else's story. And I realized something then, something simple but undeniable. This was never about him stepping in, this was about what he had revealed, what I had chosen to see. And once you see something clearly, you cannot pretend you did not. I opened my eyes again, looking at the card one more time before sliding it back into my pocket, not as a question anymore, not as a possibility, but as something already decided. I got into my car, the engine humming to life as I pulled away from the curb, the club shrinking in the rearview mirror until it was just another building, another place that no longer defined where I stood. And as I drove through the quiet streets, the city lights reflecting across the windshield, I understood something else. This was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of a version of my life I had never allowed myself to step into before, and somewhere in that city a man already knew that I would not walk away from it, because he had seen it before I did, the moment I refused to stay small. And as the road stretched out ahead of me, I realized I was not wondering what would happen next. I was ready to find out. Sleep did not come easily that night, not because I was restless, but because my mind refused to go back to the version of reality It had accepted before everything felt sharper, clearer, like someone had adjusted the focus on a lens I did not know I was looking through. I lay there staring at the ceiling, replaying every word, every pause, every look, and it was not him. I kept returning to it. Was what he had pointed out, the spaces between things, the unspoken rules, the quiet ways people gave away control without realizing it. By the time the first light slipped through my window, I was already awake, already aware that something had shifted in me in a way that could not be undone. I moved through the morning slower than usual, making coffee, getting dressed, checking my phone, even though I knew there would be nothing new. But when I reached for my bag, my hand paused for a second over the pocket where the card rested, and I felt that same weight again, not pressure, not fear, just certainty. I pulled it out, running my thumb along the edge, reading the name once more, like it might reveal something different in daylight, but it did not. It was still just a name and a number, simple and direct, like the choice attached to it. I told myself I did not need to rush, that I could take time, think it through, be rational. But even as I thought it, I knew that was not how this worked. Not anymore. This was not about waiting for the right moment. It was about recognizing that the moment had already happened. I slipped the card back into my pocket and left my apartment, the city already alive around me, people moving with purpose, cars filling the streets, the familiar rhythm of a world that had not changed even if I drove without turning on the radio. Letting the silence settle, letting my thoughts organize themselves into something clearer. By the time I reached a red light, I realized I was not debating whether I would call. I was thinking about when my phone sat in the cup holder beside me. The screen dark but present, like it was part of the decision itself. The light turned green, but I did not move right away. The cars behind me honking lightly, pulling me back into motion as I drove another block, then another, until I saw a quiet side street and pulled over. The engine idling softly. I sat there for a moment, my hand resting near my phone, not rushing, not hesitating, just aware that this was the point where everything I had been thinking became action. I picked it up, unlocking the screen, dialing the number before I could overthink it, and for a second nothing happened, just the soft ring in my ear, steady, measured. Then a voice answered, not as a man, calm, professional. Yes, he said, simply. I took a breath, grounding myself before speaking. I need to speak with Adrian Volkov. There was a brief pause, not long enough to feel uncertain, just enough to confirm something on the other end. He was expecting your call, the voice replied, and something in my chest tightened, not from surprise, but from recognition, because of course, he was. The line shifted then, and a second later I heard his voice, the same calm, controlled tone from the night before. Emily, he said, like he had already been in the middle of the conversation. You did not take long. I leaned back slightly against the seat, my grip on the phone steady now. I was not planning to, I answered, and I could almost hear the slight change in his expression through the silence that followed. Good, he said after a moment. Then you are ready to begin. I looked out through the windshield at the city moving around me, the same streets, the same people, but everything felt different now, like I was no longer just part of it. I was choosing how to move through it. I am ready, I said quietly, and as the words left my mouth, I realized they were not just an answer to him. They were a commitment to something I had not fully seen yet, but had already decided to step into, and whatever came next would not be something I stumbled into by accident. It would be something I chose every step of the way. The city looked the same when I stepped out of my car later that morning, but I did not feel the same walking through it. Every sound, every movement, every glance carried a sharper edge, like I had tuned into a frequency I could not ignore anymore. The address he gave me was not far from downtown, but it was not somewhere I had ever needed to go. Before the building stood tall, glass and steel, reflecting the sky in a way that made it feel distant, untouchable, like it existed on a different level than the streets around it. I paused on the sidewalk for half a second, taking it in, not intimidated, not exactly, but aware that crossing that threshold meant something more than just stepping inside. It meant confirming everything I had already set in motion. I pushed the door open and stepped into a space that felt quieter than it should have been, the kind of quiet that did not come from emptiness, but from control. The front desk was occupied by a man in a tailored suit, his posture straight, his attention immediate, but not intrusive, like he already knew why I was there. Emily Carter, he said before I could speak, and I nodded once, not surprised anymore, just acknowledging the pattern. This way, he added, stepping out from behind the desk and leading me toward a set of elevators. The ride up was silent, but not uncomfortable, the kind of silence that did not need to be filled, because everything that mattered had already been decided. The doors opened to a private floor, the difference In atmosphere immediate the noise of the city gone replaced by something calmer, more deliberate, like every detail here had been chosen for a reason. He guided me down a short hallway before stopping at a set of double doors. "He is expecting you," he said simply, then stepped aside without another word. I stood there for a moment, my hand hovering just above the handle, not hesitating, not doubting, just recognizing the weight of the moment before pushing the door open. The room beyond was spacious, but not excessive. Clean lines, dark tones, a large window stretching across one wall letting in natural light that softened everything just enough to keep it from feeling cold. He stood near that window, his back partially turned as he looked out over the city, like he had already been there long enough to not need to rush. When he heard the door close behind me, he turned, his gaze settling on me with that same steady focus from the night before, like nothing had changed, and yet everything had. "You found your way here," he said calmly, and I stepped further into the room, the door closing quietly behind me, sealing off the outside world. "You made it easy," I replied, my voice even but not distant. He studied me for a moment longer, then gave a slight nod, like that confirmed something again, like each step I took aligned with what he had already anticipated. "Sit," he said, gesturing toward the chair across from his desk, and I did not hesitate this time. I crossed the room and took the seat, my posture straight, my attention fully on him, not guarded, not defensive, just present. He remained standing for a second longer, then moved to sit across from me, the distance between us intentional, measured. "Last night was a test, whether you realized it or not," he said without preamble, and I felt a small shift in my chest, not surprise, not resistance, just understanding. "And I passed," I said quietly, not as a question, but as a statement. He held my gaze for a second longer before responding. "You did more than that," he said. "You proved you are willing to act without waiting for permission." His words were not praise, they were evaluation, and I recognized that difference immediately. "And now?" I asked, because I already knew there was more, because nothing about this felt finished. He leaned forward slightly, his hands resting against the desk, his attention sharpening just enough to signal a shift in the conversation. "Now you learn what to do with that," he said, and something in his tone made it clear this was where things truly began, not with the slap, not with the choice to call, but here in this moment where action turned into direction. And I realized that whatever came next would not be something I stumbled through blindly. It would be something he intended to shape, and something I had already decided to step into. Whether I fully understood it yet or not, the way he said it did not feel like an offer, it felt like a transition, like whatever I had been before this moment was no longer the version of me he was speaking to, and I could feel that shift settling deeper with every second. I held his gaze, I leaned forward slightly, not out of pressure, but because I needed to understand where this was going, not in vague terms, not in possibilities, but in something real, something I could hold on to. "Then show me," I said quietly, and the words surprised even me because there was no hesitation in them, no second guessing, just a direct step into whatever this was becoming. His expression did not change, but there was a subtle recognition in his eyes, like he had been waiting for that exact response. He stood from his chair without rushing, his movements precise, as always, and walked toward the window, gesturing slightly for me to follow. I stood and moved beside him, the city stretching out below us, cars moving in steady lines, people flowing through intersections, everything operating on patterns, most of them invisible unless you knew where to look. "What do you see?" he asked, his voice calm but focused. I looked out across the skyline, taking in the buildings, the streets, the movement. "A city," I answered simply because that was the obvious truth. He shook his head slightly. "Look again," he said, and I narrowed my focus, paying attention differently, the way he had been pushing me to since last night, not just seeing, but noticing the way certain buildings stood taller than others, the way traffic shifted around specific blocks, the subtle rhythm of movement that felt almost controlled when I really looked at it. "Patterns," I said after a moment, and he nodded once. "Everything important runs on patterns, Emily. Power does not announce itself, it organizes itself." He turned slightly, his gaze returning to me. "Most people move through this without ever understanding who is shaping those patterns or why." I felt that click into place, something simple but fundamental, like a rule I had never been taught, but had always been affected by. "And you do," I said quietly, not as a question, but as an observation. He held my gaze for a second longer. "I make sure I do," he replied, and there was no arrogance in it, no need to prove anything, just certainty. "And now you are going to learn how to see it too." I felt a slow breath leave my chest, the weight of what that meant settling in, not overwhelming, just real. "Why would you teach me that?" I asked because that question still mattered, because nothing about this was random. His expression remained steady, but there was something deeper behind it now, something more deliberate. Because you already stepped outside of the pattern once, he said. Most people never do, and the ones who do either break or adapt. I held onto that word adapt because it felt like the line between surviving and changing, between reacting and choosing. And you think I will adapt, I said, and this time there was a hint of something in my voice, not doubt, not fear, something closer to challenge. He did not hesitate. I do not think I observe, he replied, and so far you have not backed down once. That landed heavier than anything else, because it was true every step from the moment I raised my hand to now had been a choice, not a reaction. And I could feel how that had changed the way he saw me, the way I saw myself. The silence returned again, but it was not empty, it was full of something forming, something taking shape between what he was offering and what I was becoming. This is not about the club or that night anymore, he continued. That was just the moment you noticed something was wrong. Now you learn how to operate in a world where you do not ignore it. I nodded slowly, feeling the truth of that settle in completely. This was not about a single event, it was about a shift in perspective, a change in how I moved through everything. And if I fail? I asked quietly, because that possibility still existed, because nothing about this guaranteed success. His gaze did not waver. Then you will understand why most people never try, he said, and there was no judgment in it, no threat, just reality. I took that in for a second, letting it settle before nodding once more, not because I was certain of the outcome, but because I was certain of the direction. Then I guess I am not here to play it safe anymore, I said, and for the first time there was something in my voice that had not been there before, not hesitation, not caution, just clarity. And as I looked back out at the city, I realized I was no longer seeing it the way I had yesterday. I was already starting to notice the patterns, the movement, the quiet control beneath everything, and I knew that once you saw it, you could not go back to pretending you did not. The city no longer felt like something I moved through, it felt like something I was beginning to understand, and that realization stayed with me as I stood beside him, looking out over streets that suddenly seemed more intentional than chaotic. Every light, every turn, every building part of something structured, whether people noticed it or not. I crossed my arms lightly, not out of defense, but out of focus, grounding myself in the moment as everything he had said began to settle into something clearer, something usable. So, where do I start? I asked, because that was the only question that mattered now, not whether I would step forward, but how. He did not look away from the window immediately, like he was giving me time to sit with the weight of it before answering. You start by observing without reacting, he said calmly. Most people reveal more in what they do not say than what they do, and once you see that, you stop being controlled by assumptions. I nodded slowly, letting that sink in, because it felt practical, not abstract, something I could apply, not just understand. And after that, I pressed, because I knew there was more, because nothing about this was surface level. He turned, then fully facing me, his attention narrowing slightly, like the conversation had shifted into something more precise. After that, you decide what is worth your attention and what is not, he said. Power is not about controlling everything, it is about knowing what deserves your focus. I held his gaze, feeling the clarity of that settle in, because it removed the noise, the overwhelm, the idea that I needed to manage everything all at once. It simplified it into something sharper, more intentional. And you think I can do that? I asked, not doubting but confirming, because this was no longer about curiosity, it was about commitment. He did not hesitate. I know you can, he replied, and there was no room for interpretation in his voice, no exaggeration, no attempt to convince, just certainty, and that certainty grounded me more than any reassurance could have. I let out a slow breath, feeling something align inside me fully, this time not partial, not uncertain, just there. Then I will learn, I said quietly, and for the first time since this began, it did not feel like a reaction, it felt like a decision. He studied me for a second longer, then gave a slight nod, like something had finalized, like a door had fully opened and there was no reason to look back. Good, he said, and stepped away from the window, moving toward his desk with the same controlled ease as before. Because once you start seeing clearly, you will realize how much of your life was shaped by things you never questioned. I followed him slowly, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to, because walking away was no longer something that made sense to me. He stopped behind the desk, resting his hand lightly against the surface, his gaze lifting to meet mine again. And once you realize that, he continued, you do not go back to ignoring it. I felt that settle deep, not as a warning, not as a threat, but as truth, something simple and unavoidable, and I nodded once more, not needing to say anything because I understood exactly what he meant. The silence that followed was not empty, it was steady, like the beginning of something that did not need to be rushed. "You will come back tomorrow," he said after a moment, not asking, not suggesting, just stating it as part of the path ahead, and I did not question it, because I knew I would. I could already feel it, the shift in how I thought, how I moved, how I saw everything around me. "Yes," I answered simply, and this time there was no hesitation at all. He held my gaze for one last second, then turned slightly, already moving forward, already continuing whatever came next, and I realized something then, something that settled into place with complete clarity. This was not about him pulling me into his world, it was about him showing me that I had been standing at the edge of it the entire time, and the moment I chose not to step back, I had already crossed into something that would not let me remain the same. And as I stood there in that quiet room with the city stretching endlessly beyond the glass, I understood that this was only the beginning, not of a story, but of a version of myself I had never allowed to exist until now.